No phone, no music streaming, no screens of any kind, and the nearest town 3 weeks away on horseback. This was the actual daily reality for cattle drivers crossing the American plains in the late 1800s, and yet somehow these men were rarely as bored as you'd expect. After 16 hours in the saddle, herding cattle across empty grassland that stretched further than the eye could follow, a crew would gather around a fire, pull out a battered fiddle if they had one, and start making noise. Not music exactly, at least not at first, just rhythm, something to fill a silence that could otherwise feel unbearable after months on the trail. There was no saloon for 50 miles, no telegraph office, no newspaper that had arrived in under 3 weeks. And yet somehow, night after night, these men found ways to entertain themselves that would eventually shape an entire mythology of the American West. So how did a handful of exhausted, dirt-covered cowboys, cut off from every form of civilization we'd recognize today, actually spend their free time? The answer takes us through campfire storytelling competitions, homemade instruments, a surprising amount of poetry, gambling that could ruin a man in a single night, and a small-town culture of Saturday dances that somehow became the emotional center of frontier life. Let's start with the most basic fact about cowboy life, because it explains everything that follows. A cattle drive could last months, moving herds across hundreds of miles of open range with almost no contact with towns, families, or any kind of organized entertainment. The workday itself was brutal, up before dawn, in the saddle for most of daylight hours, then night watches in rotation to keep the herd from spooking. Whatever fun existed had to be improvised from almost nothing, using whatever the men happened to be carrying and whatever scraps of culture they'd brought with them from wherever they'd come from. This is the entire secret behind everything cowboy entertainment eventually became. It wasn't designed, it was assembled out of necessity, boredom, and exhaustion by men with almost no resources and an enormous amount of empty time between sunset and sleep. The most common form of entertainment by a wide margin was talk. Storytelling around the campfire wasn't just a way to pass time. It functioned as the primary information network of the entire frontier. Cowboys traded tall tales about outlaws, ghosts, near-death encounters with rattlesnakes, and increasingly exaggerated stories about their own exploits, each teller trying to top the last with a wilder version of events. These weren't casual chats, they were performances, and a cowboy with a genuine talent for spinning a story earned real social status within a crew, sometimes more respect than the fastest ropers or the best shots. Historians studying diaries and oral histories from the period have noted that this storytelling tradition directly fed into what would later become Western folklore and eventually Hollywood mythology, an entire genre of American entertainment tracing its roots back to bored men trying to out-talk each other beside a dying fire. Music came next, and it developed for reasons that were entirely practical before they became entertaining. Singing to cattle during night watches wasn't a quaint tradition. It was a functional technique. A low, steady, repetitive song calmed a nervous herd and masked the sudden noises that could otherwise trigger a stampede in the dark. Songs about lost love, dead companions, and the loneliness of the trail spread from crew to crew, evolving with each retelling the way folk music always does. Verses added or dropped depending on who was singing and what mood the herd happened to be in that particular night. Instruments were rare and precious. A fiddle or a harmonica that survived a full cattle drive without breaking was treated almost like a member of the crew, passed carefully between hands, protected from rain and dust with more care than some men gave their own boots. When an instrument wasn't available, cowboys simply built rhythm out of whatever was on hand. Spoons, tin cups, the rattle of chains, hands slapped against saddle leather. The goal was never precision. It was noise that filled silence and reminded a group of exhausted strangers that they were still, in some sense, a community. Once a drive actually reached a town, even briefly, the entire dynamic shifted completely. Saloons became the obvious center of gravity, offering cards, dice, and enough whiskey to make a man forget 3 weeks of saddle sores in a single evening. Gambling in particular carried genuine financial danger, since a cowboy's entire month of wages could disappear across a single poker table in under an hour, a risk that apparently did very little to discourage the practice given how consistently it appears across first-hand accounts from the era. Saturday night dances, meanwhile, occupied a different social space entirely. functioning as one of the few settings where men and women actually interacted in a frontier culture otherwise dominated almost entirely by male labor. These dances drew settlers from remarkable distances, sometimes traveling half a day or more just for a few hours of fiddle music and awkward, unpracticed footwork in a barn or a saloon floor cleared for the occasion. For men who had spent months speaking almost exclusively to cattle and to each other, a single evening of dancing carried an emotional weight that's easy to underestimate from a modern vantage point. Rodeo culture developed along its own separate but overlapping path, growing directly out of the actual working skills cowboys practiced every single day. Roping, riding, and branding weren't originally competitive events. They were simply the job. But competitive instinct being what it is, informal contests between crews eventually formalized into organized competitions, first as small local gatherings, and eventually into the structured rodeo circuits that persist essentially unchanged into the present day. This wasn't a separate invention layered on top of cowboy life. It was cowboy labor itself, turned inward and reshaped into a spectacle once enough men decided their everyday skills deserved an audience and a prize. Reading, surprisingly, held a meaningful place in this culture as well. Dime novels, cheap serialized adventure stories printed for a mass audience, circulated constantly among literate cowboys, passed hand to hand until the pages fell apart entirely from repeated use. Ironically, many of these novels dramatized and romanticized cowboy life itself, meaning the men living the actual, exhausting, unglamorous version of the job were simultaneously reading fictional, wildly exaggerated versions of their own profession, a strange loop that some historians argue helped cement the mythic cowboy image that Hollywood would later inherit almost wholesale. Letters served a similar function for connection to the outside world, carried for weeks by whatever rider happened to be heading toward a town with a post office, representing sometimes the only contact a cowboy had with family or a sweetheart for the entire length of a drive. Looking back across all of this, the story of cowboy entertainment is really a story about scarcity forcing creativity. Nobody set out to invent an entire cultural mythology around campfire songs and Saturday dances. Exhausted men with almost nothing available to them turned storytelling into folklore, turned cattle-calming songs into an entire genre of American music, and turned everyday labor into a national sporting tradition. Each piece grew directly out of a practical problem: silence that needed filling, nervous cattle that needed calming, isolation that needed breaking, and skill that eventually demanded an audience. None of it required a single moment of grand invention. It required months of boredom, repetition, and improvisation, carried from campfire to campfire and eventually into the wider culture that still, more than a century later, hasn't entirely let go of the myth those tired, dirt-covered men built entirely by accident.